Boker Tov, everyone, and we are here once again for another Heartfelt Haftarah. We are going to be talking this week about our second Torah portion and its Haftarah in the book of Leviticus. The Torah portion is Tzav, and our Haftarah comes from the book of Jeremiah. Now, Tzav is about the continuation of what was going on Vayikra, which was describing the various offerings, the korbanot, the different processes for offering sacrifices in the temple. Once again, we find that the rabbis, in choosing their haftarah, actually are offering a bit of a counterpoint. They are emphasizing the temple over the sacrifices, and they are even making a point about the idea of how much we should invest our faith and our devotion in even the most sacred objects. And so let's talk first of all just a little bit about what's going on. So our prophet Jeremiah, one of the big three, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. What marks Jeremiah is that he is, in many ways, the prophet of the crisis leading up to the Babylonian exile. He is living in Jerusalem at the time that Jerusalem is under threat from the Babylonians. The leadership of Jerusalem and the Judahite kingdom, I think that they're going to ally themselves with the Egyptians, and that will provide them a measure of protection. We know from other portions of Jeremiah, he tells them this is a fool's errand, and in fact, it proves that the Egyptians are not reliable allies. But in this particular case, he's got another fish to fry, another burr under his saddle. And indeed, one of the things that is often emphasized about Jeremiah is just how negative he is, how bummed out he is, how he feels that we are always on the worst possible path. That gives us the English term Jeremide. That is a rant against some terrible situation. And so it gives you a sense of how we might perceive Jeremiah as the guy who is always the downer, always the buzzkill. And now, in retrospect, we came to understand that what he had to say was actually incredibly important. But at the time, he apparently had a difficulty finding an audience beyond whoever was writing down his various oracles. And we actually know who that is. There is actually a guy, a scribe named Baruch, who followed Jeremiah around. He was basically his Boswell, and documented what Jeremiah had to say. Now, how many other allies did Jeremiah have? We don't know, but it clearly wasn't enough. And but part of this, of course, is that he was, I guess you could call him a class traitor as a priest and someone who apparently had some pretty high connections in the Jerusalem hierarchy. He nevertheless decided to break with the complacency of the leadership in Jerusalem and call them to task. Now, we're going to end there, and we're going to talk about the particular Haftarah portion. So our Haftarah portion comes from a famous part of Jeremiah's oracles, and these are known as the temple speeches or the temple oracles. And at the heart of this is not about whether we have certain political alliances and how do we deal with an external threat, but rather the illusion or delusion among people that somehow, because God's temple resides in Jerusalem, that the temple itself ensures that we will not be destroyed, because God would never let his temple get messed up, right? Now, in modern terms, among anthropologists, this would be called a fetish. A fetish is the idea that an object is occupied by a spirit, and the spirit will provide a measure of protection. It's not uncommon. It's not much different from an amulet or anything. You can make a fetish out of a small object, but in this particular case, Jeremiah is criticizing his fellow Judahites for making a fetish out of the temple, that they have deluded themselves into thinking that the presence of this structure ensures that they will never be defeated. And so it's a very important lesson that, I don't know, could you put it parallel to the teachings in the book of Job, where righteousness in and of itself does not guarantee prosperity or safety or success. So this is a parallel. And in particular, Jeremiah again reiterates the message that simply worshiping at the temple, maintaining the temple, doesn't ensure God's commitment to us. What God is looking for is something internal. So let me read to you a little bit from the passage here. Thus says the God of heaven's hosts, the God of Israel, add your whole burnt offerings to your other sacrifices and eat the meat. Now, what that means is, what's the point? You take a burnt offering, which is entirely consumed on the altar, so you don't get any benefit from it. But he says, why bother? Cook it, take it home, eat it, because it's not having the effect you think it's going to have. When I brought you your ancestors out of the land of Egypt, I neither spoke to them nor commanded them about burnt offerings or sacrifices. Now that's a puzzler, because of course we are alluding to the book of Leviticus, which according to Jewish tradition was given in the desert to instruct us in precisely the thing that Jeremiah says we didn't do. Now, there's a couple of ways of understanding this and resolving this contradiction. Maybe, of course, a critical scholar would say, maybe the book of Leviticus did not yet exist in Jeremiah's time, and the narrative of the construction of the Mishkan was not part of Israelite tradition at the time that Jeremiah lived. Now, that's plausible. There's not a lot of references to the Mishkan in later prophetic sources. So it could be that this is a story that was added later to the Israelite tradition through the book of Leviticus and the book of Exodus. Alternative way of reading this that salvages the idea that we did indeed build the Mishkan in the desert is that we were not required to make sacrifices in order to be freed from Egypt. That in fact deliverance, and that's the theme that Jeremiah is focused on, how are we going to be delivered from our present crisis with the Babylonians, that deliverance came prior to the existence of sacrifices. So don't make sacrifices, or by extension the temple, the center of your belief system. But this is the command I gave them. Listen to me, I will be your God, and you shall be my people. Now that's a quote from the book of Exodus. Walk only in the way that I have commanded you, and it will go well for you. And that, at least, is a paraphrase from the book of Deuteronomy. But they neither listened nor paid heed. In their stubbornness of their evil heart, they walked by their own counsel They went backwards instead of forwards. So again, there is this de-emphasis of the importance of the temple at large, and specifically the sacrificial system. People's goals, their ultimate attention has been displaced from God to these cultic rituals, and that this is a moral and intellectual failure on the part of the Judeans, who we will later come to know as the Jews. And so this is marking one of the important contrasts of the prophets from the Torah, is that they recognize the temple. They think the temple is important. Jeremiah is, in fact, a priest. This is his job. This is his parnasa, as we would say in Hebrew. This is his rice bowl, his meal ticket. And yet he also has a higher moral message, that while we value these things, that they are in place in order to honor God, we somehow forget that we're truly honoring God, not by the temple or by our sacrifices, but by our daily behavior. And that's exactly what he goes on to talk about. He talks about all of the problematic things that his contemporaries are doing that offends God. And as a result, the temple is not going to save them. So, we find ourselves in a weird situation today in America. And that is something that we've not really had to deal with in prior generations, which are violent threats against houses of worship. One would think that God-loving churches, synagogues, whatever, would protect the institutions that are honoring God. But it turns out we're just about as vulnerable as anybody else to external violence. And as a result, we have to create systems of security. And this is what makes problematic the famous cliche that we now have in American culture, which is offering our thoughts and prayers to the victims of this violence. Some churches, not many synagogues, would claim that our prayers are heard by God and he intervenes on our behalf. And clearly that doesn't work. If churches and religious schools, like just happened, a Christian school in Tennessee, get shot up and children are murdered, then clearly God is not answering those prayers. On the other hand, people like me would say that the purpose of our prayers is not to change God's mind, but to change our mind, to help us understand that we need to change, that the prayers remind us that we need to strive to become worthy of God, to be aligned with God. And in that interpretation, thoughts and prayers are also failing, because generally the people uttering the phrase thoughts and prayers are people who refuse to take real-time, real-life action to try and prevent these kinds of horrible mass murders in the future. So these prayers are doubly failing. I'm sure Jeremiah would have a lot to say about that, but I just wanted to draw your attention. I would tell you the function of prayer is to make us better people. And in the face of these kinds of events, these tragedies, if we're not willing to change and make the changes necessary, then these prayers are vain prayers. So enough of that. Now I'm going to turn you to one interesting little tidbit within this particular Haftarah that is intriguing. In predicting what will happen, Jeremiah doesn't pull any punches. He says that if we continue on this path, he says the following in verse 33, That is, oh, it's 8:33. I'm sorry. I don't think I actually told you what the chapter was. 8:33. The bodies of this people will be food for birds and beasts, and there will be no one to frighten them away. It's going to be a massacre. And the towns of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem I will silence. In other words, they will become deserted. Uh, the sound of joy and the sound of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride, for the land will be ruined. So the silence will be all of the celebrations that human beings normally enjoy will be silenced and the territory will be ruined. Now, and one of those funny things that Jewish tradition sometimes does is it takes things out of context and gives them an entirely different meaning. And this is something that happens occasionally in Jewish liturgy, that in order to express something with some authority, we will yank a verse out of the Bible or a couple of verses out of the Bible, and then we will put them to new context and new purpose. And I always point this out in the example of the ritual washing of a body before it's going to be buried. A lot of verses are used in that ceremony that have nothing to do with death. Rather, they're talking about how to dress a priest, or they're talking about how beautiful a person is. And both of these are recontextualized in the presence of a corpse, with this idea that having died, you join a kind of spiritual priesthood, and we dress them accordingly. And likewise, in the face of the devastation of death, we are nonetheless praising the dead person for how beautiful they are. That is not the original context of these verses, but they say some very poignant and powerful things when turned into this liturgical context. Likewise, here, what the rabbis do is they yank out the part about silence and the destruction and people being worm food and dog food. And instead, they take the line, the sounds of joy and the sounds of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride will be heard once again in the streets of Jerusalem and in the fields of Judah. That becomes the seventh blessing offered to a bride and bridegroom among the Sheva Brachot, the seven blessings that are recited as a wedding. Basically, they take the threat and they turn it into a promise. And they say that the two of you getting married, in effect, is taking us closer to the time when all of these restorations will happen for us, and the children will play and people will sing, and joy will return to Jerusalem and Judah. So in context, incomprehensible. Why is that in a wedding? But by carefully editing, they have taken this passage and turned it into a positive. And maybe that's a lesson for us, that when given lemons, we make lemonade. When Jerusalem is silenced, we imagine how Jerusalem will be when it's repopulated. So that is just a very arch example of Jewish optimism, using some pretty negative scriptures. We turn it on its head and we make the best of what we have. Well, thank you for listening, and I look forward to talking to you next week about our next Haftarah portion.